Usually building professional trust is, it's a slow burn.
Oh, absolutely. It takes time.
Right. I mean, think about it like planting a tree. You plant the seed, you water it with a few early deliverables, you give it, plenty of sunshine in the form of those weekly status meetings.
Right. The endless status meetings.
Exactly. And slowly, over months or maybe even years, that trust finally grows. But, and this is what we're getting into today, when you step into the world of enterprise technology and massive system modernizations, that entire slow burn theory just gets completely thrown out the window.
It really does. I mean, the timeline compresses from years into just weeks.
Yeah.
We are looking at a really fascinating dynamic today. It's based on an article from April 6, 2026, published by Codora, and it's titled, What Modernization Partners Must Prove in the First 30 Days to Win Enterprise Trust. And honestly, the premise challenges basically every instinct a tech vendor has when they sign a new contract.
Okay, let's unpack this because the central paradox set up in this source is what hooked me immediately.
Yeah, it's a great setup.
You have these modernization partners, the vendors, right? Walking into day one of a massive contract, assuming trust is earned gradually. They have their 6-month roadmap, their sprint schedule.
They're ready to go.
Right. And they think, if I just hit my milestones, the client will eventually trust me. But the enterprise buyer sitting across the table, they aren't waiting 6 months.
Not at all.
According to Codora, that buyer has largely made up their mind about whether you are competent within the first few weeks, which is just wild to think about.
It is wild, but to understand why that buyer is so aggressively judgmental right out of the gate, we really have to look at the psychological baggage they're bringing to the table.
Oh, the baggage is heavy.
Extremely. Enterprises carry a tremendous amount of past trauma into these modernization programs. I mean, think about the stakes of ripping out a legacy system.
Right. It's never just a simple upgrade.
No, it's highly complex, it's incredibly expensive, and historically, it is fraught with absolute disaster. These buyers, they've lived through multi-million-dollar budget overruns. They've seen 3-year initiatives just stall out completely and quietly get swept under the rug.
Right. So they aren't blank slates. They are sitting there with the scars of past failure.
Exactly. And the deepest scars usually come from partners who sounded incredibly confident during the slick sales pitch.
Right. The honeymoon phase.
Yeah, but the moment they actually got under the hood and saw how convoluted the legacy architecture was, they panicked. The vendor floundered, the timeline slipped, and the enterprise was just left holding the bag.
Wow.
So the buyer isn't waiting to see if a partner can eventually deliver. They're watching like hawks right now to see if the partner actually comprehends the mess they just inherited.
Which introduces a really vital distinction the article makes between two distinct concepts, and those are velocity versus signal.
Yeah.
And this seems to be where vendors completely misread the room in that crucial first month.
Oh, completely. The instinct for any vendor is to optimize for velocity.
Just move fast.
Right. Velocity is simply moving fast. It's checking off tasks, provisioning cloud environments, scheduling like a dozen discovery workshops, generating JRA tickets.
Making a lot of noise.
Yes. Vendors love velocity because it creates a feeling of momentum. But the enterprise doesn't actually care about velocity in month one. They are desperate for signal.
Signal. Okay, explain the difference there.
Well, signal is entirely different. Signal is concrete evidence that the partner has the capacity to reduce uncertainty.
Let me put myself in the vendor's shoes for a second, though. I mean, I just signed a massive high-stakes contract. The pressure is on.
For sure.
If my client is nervous and traumatized by past failures, wouldn't seeing me and my team furiously working and, moving fast put them at ease? It feels totally counterintuitive to not show a flurry of activity.
It feels counterintuitive to the traditional sales motion, absolutely. But let's look at how the buyer interprets that flurry of activity. If an enterprise buyer sees a vendor rushing to execute tasks before they've fully grasped the deep, undocumented complexities of the system, they don't see a dedicated partner. They see a massive liability.
Oh, interesting.
Let's bring it down to the ground level. It's like, well, it sounds like hiring a contractor for your house, right?
That's a great analogy.
Yeah. If they immediately start ripping down walls without looking at the plumbing, their velocity is actually terrifying. You want to signal that they know where the pipes are.
I love that. You want to signal they know where the pipes are.
Yeah.
Because if they're just swinging a sledgehammer, you're terrified because they are moving faster than their understanding warrants. They're basically flying blind.
Exactly. And the article notes that once that fear takes root, the skepticism compounds. It becomes almost impossible to reverse.
Wow.
Every subsequent delay is viewed through a lens of suspicion. Every new risk the vendor eventually stumbles into isn't seen as a normal project hurdle. It's confirmation that the vendor is completely out of their depth.
So trust, once lost in those early days, because you prioritized reckless velocity over signal, it rarely recovers.
Rarely, if ever.
Think about that in your own professional life, right? How often do we rush to show activity to a boss or a client when what they actually crave is proof that we understand the complexity of the problem?
We all do it. It's human nature to want to look busy.
So if we accept that we need to send the right signal to reduce uncertainty, we have to define what that actually looks like in practice. The Codora piece breaks this down into 3 specific proofs required in the first 30 days. And here's where it gets really interesting.
Yeah, this is the core of it.
The first one is a demonstrable understanding of system behavior. Now, my initial thought was, okay, the vendor just needs to show off their technical chops. But the article is adamant that enterprises do not care about a partner's general tech resume once the contract is signed.
Right, because the baseline skills are already assumed. I mean, you wouldn't have won the bid if you didn't know modern reference architectures or Kubernetes or whatever the target stack is.
Obviously.
What the buyer is desperately looking for is evidence that you understand their specific, unique, heavily customized system.
The messy reality of it.
Exactly. They need to know you grasp the actual execution paths, the deeply embedded business rules, the exception handling that someone hard-coded 6 years ago.
Oh man, the legacy code.
Right, and all the fragile integration dependencies.
But how do you actually prove that in 30 days? I mean, the natural vendor instinct would be to just ask the client for their system architecture diagrams and start studying. But the article points out that relying on inherited documentation is incredibly dangerous. Why is inherited documentation so dangerous?
Because in the enterprise world, documentation is basically a fossil record of good intentions.
A fossil record, that's so true.
It is. It is almost always outdated the exact moment it gets published. Over the years, you have emergency hotfixes in production, you have developers leaving the company, temporary workarounds that quietly become permanent structural load bearers.
It's like trying to navigate a modern city using a map drawn 50 years ago.
Yes, that's a perfect way to look at it. Or I like to think of it as trying to translate a dead language where the native speakers, the original developers who hacked together the billing engine over a weekend back in 2015, they've all left the company. You can't just read their outdated dictionary.
You have to observe how the language is being used in the wild right now.
Exactly. If a vendor comes in, reads the old Confluence pages, and just regurgitates those high-level diagrams back to the client in a presentation, the client instantly knows the vendor isn't engaging with reality.
Because the client knows their own docs are wrong.
Right. So to generate true signal, the source states that vendors must validate assumptions by observing actual system behavior. They need to put probes in the live environment, trace API calls, analyze live database locks.
Get their hands dirty.
Yeah, and find the mismatches between what the documentation claims and what the code is actively doing.
So the real credibility building moment isn't when the vendor says, "We understand your system." It's when the vendor says, "Hey, your documentation says this data flows sequentially, but we ran a trace on your live traffic and found a parallel batch process that's causing a race condition."
What's fascinating here is that is the exact moment trust is forged. The vendor is suddenly speaking in concrete, verifiable realities rather than theoretical abstractions.
Right.
And the article explicitly notes that all your beautiful timelines, your product plans, your agile methodologies, they are completely discounted by the enterprise if they don't believe you possess that ground-level understanding.
A polished Gantt chart means absolutely nothing if you don't know how their custom data ingestion logic actually behaves.
Nothing at all.
Which naturally leads us to the consequences of digging that deep. Because when you bypass the bad documentation and trace the actual code, you are inevitably going to uncover skeletons.
Oh, you will definitely find skeletons.
You are going to find massive problems the client didn't even know they had. And how a partner handles those newly discovered problems dictates the next phase of trust. According to this source, the second major proof is providing early visibility into risk, with a strict mandate against late surprises.
This is perhaps the largest friction point in any modernization project. The text clearly states that trust accelerates when risk is surfaced early and discussed openly.
Okay.
And it rapidly erodes when risk is hidden and later framed as some sort of unavoidable surprise.
Nobody liked that kind of surprise.
Right. In that first month, the enterprise fully expects the partner to find fragile integrations. They know their legacy system is a bit of a disaster. They don't expect you to magically resolve a massive, undocumented compliance vulnerability in week 3, but they absolutely expect you to put it on the table.
See, I want to explore the psychology of the vendor here, though. Why do partners hide these risks? Is it just to preserve early momentum and keep the client happy? Because it happens constantly.
It does happen constantly.
If I am the modernization partner, the ink is barely dry on our agreement.
Mhm.
Everyone's in the honeymoon phase, popping champagne. I don't want to walk into the boardroom on day 14 and say, hey, your core architecture is fundamentally broken and this is going to be way harder than we thought.
Yeah, you feel like you're ruining the party.
Right. Aren't I risking the client's anger or even the contract itself by blowing up the optimism that early?
The urge to delay bad news is deeply ingrained in professional services. Vendors want to maintain that momentum. The internal monologue is usually, let's keep this quiet for now. We'll engineer a clever workaround in the background, and the client will never even need to worry about it.
Oh, I've definitely had that exact thought process.
We all have. It comes from a desire to be helpful, not malicious. But the article points out the tragic irony of this approach. When the enterprise inevitably finds out about the risk, and they always do, usually when a major milestone is missed, they don't view the delayed disclosure as an attempt to be helpful.
How do they view it then?
They view it as a symptom of incompetence. Yeah. Let's look at a timeline. If you surface a massive tangled dependency on day 15, the buyer's reaction is, thank God you found that before we started writing new code. Let's adjust the scope. You're doing your job.
Okay, that makes sense.
But if you surface that exact same tangled dependency on day 90, the buyer's reaction is, you have been inside our system for 3 months and you are just finding this now. What else have you completely missed?
So the delay shifts the narrative from we uncovered a tough problem to you don't know what you're doing.
Precisely.
Trying to protect the client from bad news actually destroys your credibility.
It does. Kodora argues that partners who win early trust actually treat risk discovery as a massive victory in the opening phase.
Wow, a victory.
Yeah. When you bring an ugly reality to the table early, you completely shift the dynamic. You're no longer an outsider trying to sell a smooth service. You become an insider actively sharing the burden of a complex reality. It allows the enterprise to participate in the strategic decisions rather than just receiving bad news after the fact.
Think about your own team for a second, right? Are you treating risk discovery as a success metric in the early days? Or are you quietly sweeping it under the rug in your status meetings just to keep the mood light? It is a fundamental shift in how we define a good update.
And it really sets the stage for how information is handled moving forward, which
Yeah.
brings up the issue of who actually gets to hold on to all this valuable, hard-won knowledge.
Right, which is the third proof. Shared intelligence and the absolute elimination of black boxes.
Yes. Enterprises are becoming highly sensitive to knowledge hoarding. Imagine a scenario where a vendor comes in, maps the system perfectly, uncovers all the hidden risks, develops a brilliant modernization strategy.
That's great so far.
But then they keep all that system knowledge locked away in their own proprietary tools, or worse, isolated in the heads of their lead engineers.
Oh, I see.
The buyer is left completely in the dark about the actual mechanics of the solution.
I have to push back on this from the vendor's perspective, though. If I'm the partner, isn't my proprietary knowledge my leverage? I mean, I spent the time and resources to decode their messy legacy code. If I just open the books and give all that intelligence back to the client's internal team, don't I lose my value? I'm basically training them so they don't need me anymore.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that mindset is exactly what keeps vendors relegated to being easily replaceable contractors rather than strategic partners.
Interesting.
Replaceable.
Yeah. The source is unambiguous on this point. Hoarding knowledge places a hard ceiling on the level of trust an enterprise will ever extend to you. From the buyer's perspective, an opaque vendor is a massive operational risk.
Because they don't know what's going on behind the curtain.
Right. They worry about what happens when the vendor's key architect takes a vacation or when the contract eventually expires. They see a black box as a form of hostage taking.
So keeping the knowledge secret to ensure job security actually makes the client want to fire you sooner because they just feel trapped. Exactly. Conversely, true shared intelligence proves that the vendor's goal is to make the enterprise stronger. when a partner makes their understanding of the system totally visible, when they invite the internal architects to review the live traces and validate the newly discovered business rules together, it signals supreme confidence.
Yeah.
It's no longer the vendor delivering a finished artifact from behind a curtain. The understanding is co-created.
Co-created rather than delivered as a black box. That is a powerful concept because it forces alignment. If the internal enterprise engineers and the external vendor engineers are looking at the exact same transparent data, you eliminate the whole us versus them dynamic.
And the buyer receives the ultimate reassurance. They are building long-term institutional capability, not just renting a short-term fix. They know the intelligence won't just walk out the door when the project ends.
Okay, so if the old way of hoarding knowledge is broken and the old way of hiding risks is broken, then the traditional way we measure success in those first 30 days has to be completely reevaluated as well.
It absolutely does.
The article dedicates its final section to the trap of traditional status reporting, which ties all of this together perfectly.
Yeah, for decades, the industry standard for early project management has been the weekly status dashboard. You know exactly what this looks like, right?
The giant spreadsheet.
Right, a spreadsheet showing percentage of tasks complete, environments provisioned, tickets closed, a sea of green, yellow, and red indicators.
Yep.
But Codora makes a brilliant distinction here. Those traditional reports only answer one fundamental question. Are we busy?
Look at all these green check marks. We are generating so much velocity.
Exactly. But as we established earlier, the enterprise buyer isn't asking if you are busy. The question keeping them up at night is, do you understand what you're changing?
Right.
And early in an engagement, leaning too heavily on task completion metrics can backfire terribly. If a vendor shows rapid progress and a high burn rate of task on a deeply complex legacy system, but they haven't yet demonstrated that deep, verifiable understanding of the execution paths,
It just feels reckless to the buyer.
yes, it amplifies their anxiety instead of relieving it.
Let me make sure I'm wrapping my head around this correctly. So the text is literally saying an enterprise buyer will tolerate slower, visible progress like fewer green check marks, fewer completed tickets, if they are confident that you actually understand the system.
Yes, entirely.
Wow.
The source stresses that buyers will happily trade performative progress for substantive clarity. A clear, detailed presentation of how a brittle billing module actually interacts with a third-party API carries exponentially more weight in week 3 than delivering a hastily written batch of new code.
That makes total sense.
System intelligence making that understanding visible, verifiable, and shared compresses the time it takes to build trust. It shifts conversations from basic discovery to actual decision-making.
Because substantive clarity means you aren't guessing anymore. Once you have that shared, verified understanding of the system and the risks, the project shifts out of that anxious discovery phase and into actual confident execution.
And that is how trust ceases to be a slow burn. You don't need 6 months of flawless deliverables to earn trust. If you can prove in 30 days that you see the system as clearly, or maybe even more clearly, than the client does.
So what does this all mean? If we zoom out and look at the entire framework Codora lays out, winning the first 30 days doesn't guarantee that a multi-year project will be flawless, right?
No, of course not. There will always be bugs.
Right. But losing those first 30 days almost guarantees a combative, high-friction relationship for the rest of the contract. The ultimate quote to remember from Codora, the one that anchors this whole concept, is, trust isn't built by progress reports. It's built by clarity.
It is a phenomenal distillation of the problem, and I'd encourage you, as you reflect on these insights, to audit your own first 30 days process in whatever you do.
Yeah, it applies everywhere.
Whether you are starting a new job, taking on a new client, or launching an internal project, are you optimizing for activity just to look busy? Or are you optimizing for clarity, depth of understanding, and bringing hidden risks out into the light?
It really challenges the traditional professional playbook. We are so grateful you joined us for this deep dive today. And before we go, I want to leave you with one final, slightly provocative thought to mull over on your own.
Ooh, I like where this is going.
We've spent this entire time talking about how radical transparency and intentionally surfacing the absolute ugliest risks in the first 30 days is the secret to winning bulletproof professional trust. Now, what happens if you apply that exact same framework to the first 30 days of a personal relationship,
Oh, wow.
right? If you bypass the polite documentation of the honeymoon phase and lay out all your personal fragile integrations and undocumented behaviors right up front on day 3,
That is a bold strategy.
does that full system intelligence and early risk visibility kill the romance entirely? Or does it build an unbreakable bond? Something to think about. We will catch you on the next deep dive.